Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, a Democrat of New York, a member of the Budget Committee. And Congressman, we had Tom Davis, a former Republican congressman, sitting in your seat in the last segment, and he was basically saying if the Democrats think that at the end of the day there's just going to be the debt ceiling is just going to be raised, the government's just going to be reopened, and there's not going to be some kind of negotiation, some kind of bargaining, some kind of concessions on the Democratic side, they're wrong. What do you say to that?
Well, it's important to understand that I think the Democrats have been ready to talk since the early spring as part of the regular budgetary process. What was supposed to have occurred in the Congress, the House passed the budget in March, the Senate passed the budget shortly thereafter. The next step in the process is for both sides to appoint members of a conference committee to sit down together, try and find common ground and work out the differences. Since the early spring, the Republicans have refused to appoint members of a conference committee. And so essentially for the last 6 or 7 months, the Republicans have been the ones who have declined steadfastly to negotiate. So then we arrive at a point in time where we have to pass a continuing resolution in order to keep the government open. And what the Democrats have said, as well as the president, is clearly we're not going to govern as a result of your extortion demands. They sent over a series of ransom notes that were all designed to either defund, delay, or destroy the Affordable Care Act, which was clearly the law of the land. Once we reopen the government and move toward a situation where we're confronting the debt ceiling and hopefully lift the debt ceiling to avoid a default, then I think we'll be back in a situation where we can discuss the future of the American economy and how to best move forward.
So the position is, that you seem to be articulating there, is raise the debt ceiling, reopen the government, then you can talk about anything, but there should be no conditions on those first two.
Well, it's also important to note that Democrats have already agreed to compromise in a meaningful way as it relates to keeping the government open at a certain funding level.
Right, you'll accept the sequester level of spending, the Republican level of spending, a much lower level of spending. But I wonder, too, is there a sense, do you have a sense, and is there a sense among Democrats in Washington that there's a bigger principle at stake here in terms of, maybe President Obama in 2011, when we walked right up to that debt ceiling deadline, made a mistake in having these negotiations with the Republicans and in setting a precedent that, when the debt ceiling comes up, this is something you can bargain over, and this is now a moment when that has to be corrected, when that precedent has to be sort of taken off the books. Is that part of what's motivating Democrats here?
Well, from my perspective, I certainly think there is a bigger perspective or principle that's at stake. There are 3 ways in which you can change law. One, through the legislative process. The Democrats were successful in 2010 in passing the Affordable Care Act by a duly elected Congress. You can also change law jurisprudentially through the court system when something has been declared unconstitutional. In this particular instance, 2012, the Affordable Care Act was declared constitutional, an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, a Bush nominee. And then you can change things as a result of the election process. That also occurred in 2012 when the president was reelected in an electoral college landslide. And so there's got to be a principle that threatening a shutdown or threatening the default on our debt and plunging the world back into a recession is not an acceptable form of negotiating.
Well, so how do you think this is all going to end then? I mean, I understand what the Democratic position on this is. We also have the reality of now we're entering the 2nd week of the shutdown, and there are a lot of these, Republicans, at least members of the House, who come from these, we talk about it all the time, these safely Republican districts. They don't really have to worry about general elections. Realistically, I mean, when we get close, if we start getting close to that debt default deadline, it's one thing to have the principle of, we shouldn't be negotiating over this. Another to say, we're staring at a default here. We can't have that happen either. So how do you expect ultimately this is going to end?
Well, I don't think that we're going to confront a default. There are forces within the Republican Party, as well as the Wall Street finance community base, that understand the implications of defaulting on our debt. And John Boehner, as you indicated earlier, Steve, has already sent the signals that he understands the catastrophic consequences that will be brought about if we were to default on our debt. I do think that reasonable minds will prevail the closer that we get to that October 17th deadline. And hopefully, moving forward from that point, we can then sit down at the table through the regular process and negotiate items related to our future.
Well, I mean, I think the thing with we have to remember is that this is being driven by this very small group of Republicans within the House. And, people like Ted Yoho and Michelle Bachmann would probably win fewer votes than Anthony Weiner if they ran here in New York City. These are people who could not even win state elections. These are people who could not even win the Iowa straw poll in some instances. I mean, the Iowa caucuses, and it just... it's a group of people who I think in the end will find themselves a little bit isolated as Republican donors and the business lobby comes on board and says, look, we're getting down to the wire here. This is not good for our candidates who are running at the state level. The governors aren't very happy with this strategy. It's terrible for for Republicans long term in terms of presidential prospects. And I think there will be a certain amount of pressure coming to bear on the more reasonable members of the Republican Party that
and the Congressman Jeffries mentioned this too, David. Is that something in your reporting you're picking up on? Is that sort of external pressure on Republicans from the business community or something? Is that real right now?
No, it's very weak. The business community's still not learned how to lobby Republicans in a way that forces them away from the conservative base. We saw it with multiple debt negotiations in 2011. We saw it in 2012. They spend money on lobbyists. I mean, Fix the Debt. Remember that group could raise $30 million and get famous spokespeople, and they just don't know how to bend the ear of enough Republicans to make a difference. When I talked to some of the moderates this was Thursday, who were on record saying they would vote for a clean CR. Moderate Republicans from swing seats. Scott Ridgell, who represents Norfolk not Norfolk, but Tidewater, part of the government contractor utopia that is really hurt by shutdown. He was saying, there's a lot of momentum on the side of the guys who just want to say no, and he wasn't going to buck from the party until then. So you see whip counts where there are 22 Republicans ready to break or that have pressure put on them by the financial industry, and they're not breaking because that's not as effective as heritage action, telling people to call their offices.
And very quickly, and Congressman, before we go there, I just want to ask, I mean, so let's say we get through all of this. Let's say we get through the shutdown. Let's say we get through the debt ceiling. All the deals that I'm seeing potentially talk about like December 15th, that we would fund the government through December 15th. Are we just about to go through this again in 2 months when this is all over?
Well, I certainly hope not. And in some iterations, at least the Senate Democratic perspective is that we should fund the government through November 15th, which would place us even closer in the context
do it in a month instead.
of a renewed negotiation. But I do think that, at the end of the day, reasonable minds will prevail, hopefully, in the House Republican caucus. Initially, Peter King was the only one who had sort of come out and said this is madness. Now we're up to over 20 Republicans. We've all gone back to our districts this weekend. Hopefully we're hearing an airfill from the American public about getting our acts together, go back down to the Congress, get back to doing the business of the American people.
Okay.